Released in 1994 for the Super Nintendo, Final Fantasy VI made a lasting impact on video games worldwide, winning numerous awards for both gameplay and music alike. As the sixth installment in the series, the game is known in many circles as a defining moment in role-playing games, with its highly complex story and its extensive cast of playable and non-playable characters, each with a deep character history that is explored both narratively and sonically throughout the game. Regarding the music, veteran composer Nobuo Uematsu wrote 61 individual works to accompany the gameplay, exploiting the use of primary and secondary leitmotifs, as well as different transformations of a cyclic theme in ways virtually unseen at the time. What is truly remarkable is that Uematsu unifies virtually the entire soundtrack with only a few short motives and their various transformations, many of which take on symbolic meaning as the game unfolds. Even more impressive is that these motives are all foreshadowed within the opening sequence of the game, titled Omen, which begins as a satiric parody of the introduction to Richard Strauss's Also Spake Zarathustra. This paper will focus on two of the main features of the introduction to Final Fantasy VI. First, I apply S.C. Scheinberg's theories on satire and parody to Omen, discussing the various structural connections between it and other musical cues that it foreshadows. By exposing the ironic nature of the game's introduction, the true meaning of Omen will be revealed, as most theorists agree that irony is saying one thing while meaning another. Additionally, I explore the second half of Uematsu's Omen, which consists of a short piano prelude, which, as I explore, consists of what I argue is the most important motivic unit inherent within many important compositions within the soundtrack. As I'll demonstrate, the entire opening sequence to Final Fantasy VI foreshadows all of the most important motives, harmonies, and even symbolic narrative plot devices within the game to a level not matched by any of the game's predecessors or contemporaries. As the final installment of the game for the Super Nintendo console, Final Fantasy VI is recognized as the game that shifted the narrative within the franchise away from a medieval setting and toward a more futuristic and science fiction atmosphere. Indeed, while Final Fantasy VI makes use of medieval plot devices like castles and empires, it was the first in the series to introduce more sophisticated technology like collieries, modern machinery and weaponry, and even genetic engineering. To reflect this new steampunk atmosphere, Final Fantasy VI begins unlike any of its predecessors. Absent are the bright blue screens providing backstory for the gamer, accompanied by a major mode prelude. No images of crystals and no trumpet fanfares announce the game's cyclic theme. Instead, Final Fantasy VI begins with a dark, foreboding title screen in what appears to be a reverse negative of the sunrise depicted in the opening of Nietzsche's novel Also Spake Zarathustra. It is therefore not surprising that Uematsu's musical accompaniment satirically parodies the introduction to Strauss's tone poem of the same name by both exaggerating and distorting Strauss's opening nature motif. These distortions result in an ironic musical gesture that foreshadows many important narrative and musical events throughout the game. The nature, or sunrise, motif that begins Zarathustra is so ingrained in our culture that it almost needs no discussion. Reflecting upon the bright and optimistic nature of the novel and the announcement of Nietzsche's Übermensch, Strauss begins his introduction with the first four notes of the naturally occurring harmonic series over a C pedal before launching into his fanfare, answered with thunderous tonic and dominant pitches in the timpani, reaffirming the C tonic. With the addition of the E that initiates the fanfare, Strauss completes the naturally occurring consonant major harmony, which correlates with nature. As Scheinberg discusses, these musical signifiers lie within the culturally favored realm of the spectrum. Both Robert Hatton and Scheinberg discuss the correlation surrounding ascending musical gestures in their writing. While Scheinberg correlates ascending lines as a physical reaching, Hatton's encultured correlation lies with the notion of yearning or aspiring. Interestingly, in his autobiography, Nietzsche uses similar terms like strive, aim, and desire to describe the heroic type after admitting that he himself is a reverse of the heroic nature. Considering how Zarathustra preaches the Übermensch as the ultimate being that man must strive to become after announcing the death of God, it seems logical that Strauss would begin his tone poem with the ascending line, which ultimately leads to the major chord sonority at the conclusion of the entire introduction. In her discussion on satire, Scheinberg provides several definitions pertinent to Omen. Satire, she writes, is a subclass of irony. It has two layers of meaning, one ostensible and one hidden, of which the hidden should be preferred. She goes on to suggest that satire aggressively ridicules a given set of norms through a variety of distortion techniques. These include the removal of an essential component of the satirized object, the insertion of a new component, and the replacement of one or more of the object's characteristic components. She also writes about various types of exaggeration, stating that satirical exaggeration is a kind of distortion in which certain characteristics that are to be perceived as deficient are exaggerated and thus highlighted. Regarding the structure of parody, she writes that it is a bit more cumbersome to define, but ultimately decides on Lydia Hutchins' description that parody is a form of imitation, but imitation characterized by ironic inversion, not always at the expense of the parodied text, as illustrated in her diagram reproduced here. As satire, Omen is a structurally distorted and exaggerated imitation of Zarathustra's introduction, as they both begin with an ascending line of long-held, perfect-sized intervals before playing a two-note fanfare comprised of a descending melodic second. Uematsu begins Omen by stripping away every instrument except for the organ, the instrument present at both the beginning and end of Strauss's introduction, and an important instrument for the sake of narrative within the game. He replaces the three-note nature motif with a series of 6 notes, each a perfect fourth higher than the previous. Seasoned fans of Final Fantasy series will recognize this recurring musical motive in Uematsu's language and may even associate as a symbol of evil, as I've explored elsewhere. Uematsu makes this ascending gesture the focal point of the music, placed in direct opposition to the descending video sequence, thus creating a layer of irony for the player that demands further scrutiny. Uematsu's exaggeration of the nature motif ultimately results in a dissonant sonority, a sonic cluster containing almost every pitch of the diatonic scale. Contrary to Zarathustra, it creates a sonority that is culturally disfavored, which foreshadows the horrors committed by the game's antagonists, Emperor Gestahl and his second-in-command, Kefka. Especially interesting is Uematsu's choice of beginning Omen on E instead of C, the pitch that initiates Zarathustra. By beginning with E, Uematsu ultimately concludes the phrase with a purely white key cluster that implies a Phrygian scale, the darkest diatonic mode that still contains a perfect fifth above its tonic. This results in the use of the same notes, but a different rotation of the C major scale presented in Zarathustra, thereby providing a dark reflection or shadow of Strauss's introduction. The Phrygian implication is also structurally present between the beginning E and final F 2 octaves higher in the organ. The voice exchange that takes place when the choir sings its distorted fanfare further demonstrates the importance of the Phrygian mode, as the bass moves up by a half step. Indeed, Emperor Gestahl's own leitmotif, as well as many other significant pieces in the game, reside primarily in the Phrygian. Approximately 10 pieces in the soundtrack reside primarily in the Phrygian mode, and many others move to the Neapolitan harmonies for means of expression. Almost 30% of the game's soundtrack relies on Phrygian harmonies. Thus, the Phrygian mode, as implied in the opening of Omen, becomes a harmonic motive in the game, symbolically referring to the horrors committed by the Gestahlian Empire. The structurally ascending minor second in the bass of the opening fanfare is also manifested in Dancing Mad, the music accompanying the final battle, in which the player must defeat Kefka after his ascent into godhood. Although the music begins with C Phrygian tonality, typically associated with Gestahl, the music ascends by half step to D flat at the second tier of the battle, announcing Kefka's ascension to godhood. Indeed, it is here when the organ enters with musical motives associated with Kefka. Further distortion in Omen is evident in the fanfare itself, which I argue motivically foreshadows Kefka, the main antagonist who betrays the Emperor. Strauss's optimistic and mostly consonant brass fanfare is replaced by a two-note dissonant fanfare presented in the organ and choir, played as a descending minor second. This fanfare is played twice in succession. While the second chord is held for 3 seconds the first time, the listener is exposed to the dissonant chord cluster for an uncomfortable 6 seconds during the second statement, with no tonic dominant affirmation that was present in Strauss's timpani. These dissonances, in addition to other musical components either removed or exaggerated, help Uematsu set the tone for the game's narrative of an evil empire hell-bent on world domination. But is that all he is saying? The use of the organ and choir in Omen hint toward a deeper religious connotation underlying Uematsu's musical meaning. Among many of the religious undertones in the game is Emperor Gestahl's desire to be worshipped, which he utters right after Kefka betrays him. As we learn throughout the game, Gestahl subjected a young Kefka to scientific experiments with the goal of creating a soldier with magical abilities. And as we learn halfway through the game, these experiments caused something to snap in Kefka's mind, which leads him to eventually kill Gestahl and assume the power of the gods for himself. And while Gestahl initially experimented on Kefka as a child, it seems naive to assume that he did not covet the use of the magic for himself and would have used it for personal gain to realize his own ambitions for godhood. To be sure, the descending second fanfare motive is exploited in all of the music associated with Kefka. Among them are his main leitmotif and the final battle against him. In the second half of the game, we are even witness to a cult of Kefka after Kefka conquers the world, assuming the role of God on Earth. The religious cult worships Kefka, fearing that he will destroy those who disobey him with his dreaded light of judgment. The music accompanying the cult of Kefka contains further harmonic distortions of the opening fanfare. The rising perfect fourths that initiated the game are now replaced with minor thirds, which create a fully diminished seventh chord built on E flat. This results in the further dissonant octatonic scale. The introduction, which functions as dominant to A flat, leads directly to a choir chanting a melody based loosely off the original fanfare that consisted of a descending minor second first heard in Omen, all of which is accompanied by a Phrygian bass line centered around A flat. As Kylie Primus describes, it is evident that Kefka is a product of genetic testing to make him into a superior magical being, yet has failed to become an Übermensch, and just another nihilistic villain that needs to be put down. Can this be the hidden meaning in Uematsu's opening to Omen? I believe it is. As a harmonic distortion of Strauss's opening, Uematsu could have opted for a series of stacked perfect fifths, which would have still created a dissonant diatonic cluster accompanying the game's introduction. However, there is a hidden meaning behind the rising perfect fourths that go beyond the simple dissonant nature of the interval and scale. For as one ascends through perfect fourths, one actually descends through circle of fifths, thus moving closer toward the darker Phrygian mode and further distancing itself from the consonant Ionian. If ascending motions are correlated with aspiration and yearning, then perhaps hidden descending motions are their negative reflection. To be sure, Uematsu's exaggerated ascending motive that initiates the game may represent a man who continues to reach higher and higher toward godhood for his own evil ambitions, defying nature and nature's god, ultimately leading to his downfall. Put simply, as Gestahl and Kefka reach higher to become god, they fall more deeply into the abyss, ultimately leading to their own demise. Indeed, Gestahl's twisted ambition of godhood and his manipulation and distortion of nature through magitech research ultimately result in his own downfall and the rise of the failed Übermensch, all of which is demonstrated and foreshadowed brilliantly in the first half of Omen. While Uematsu's satirical parody of Zarathustra foreshadows both Gestahl and Kefka, it is his short piano prelude that follows the fanfare that foreshadows the heroes within the game. It is important to note that the first 4 games in the series all begin with a charming and bright piano prelude that shares a resemblance to Bach's C major prelude from Book 1 of Well-Tempered Clavier. While absent from the introduction to Final Fantasy VI, Uematsu provides a different prelude, one that consists of planed dominant 7th chords in various inversions. While seemingly innocuous, this prelude exposes the listener to a recurring 3-note motive as the basis for its melodic content. It is with this motive that Uematsu demonstrates his ability to unify an entire soundtrack with utmost subtlety. This motive is itself an inversion of the melodic motive that Uematsu uses to unify all of the protagonists, musically and symbolically, throughout the game. As each character's history involves some form of tragedy through loss of abandonment, I call this unifying motive the tragic motive. The inclusion of the motive in all of its different harmonic and structural contexts within the soundtrack lends itself to a semiological interpretation of the motive. Through its inscription, Uematsu invites attentive listeners to draw new interpretations about the character, their current surroundings, and their tragic histories, as well as possible future events not yet played through, thereby creating a stronger dynamic between player and game that they dedicate hours of their lives to complete. While it would be impossible due to time constraints to demonstrate each example of how Uematsu exploits this motive throughout the game, I have included a partial listing of different uses of the motive as well as a musical example for these listenings. Of particular importance of the different emotional affect that each use of the motive implies. While some pieces involve more heroic and optimistic musical tropes, other pieces are more playful, while yet others seem to evoke sadness and even bittersweet nostalgia. I would conclude by stating that Final Fantasy VI is probably one of the most discussed and researched game in the field of ludomusicology. After giving a paper on a similar topic at the North American Conference on Video Game Music in 2019, I was approached by several attendees who mentioned that they had seen a paper on this very game every year that they have attended the Ludo conferences. Indeed, I was not the only person who discussed this game at that particular conference. Musicologists and theorists alike who are interested in video game soundtracks are mostly quite familiar with this game, and there's a good reason for it. The analysis I've just presented really only scratches the surface to this cinematic game. Final Fantasy VI set the bar incredibly high for future video game developers. By creating such a compelling story with such complicated characters, the game demanded a soundtrack that not only accompanied the story, but one that told the story. By composing 16 character leitmotifs as well as multiple transformations of those leitmotifs, Uematsu not only reflects the story being played through, he also invites players to draw their own interpretations about the characters' relationships within the game. It is pretty remarkable to consider how much musical symbolism and unity Uematsu creates with a single introduction. What's more remarkable is that I haven't even discussed the game's cyclic theme, its transformations throughout the game, and its connection to the Gestahlian Empire, as well as the protagonists. Indeed, much can be learned from analyzing this classic soundtrack from the 16-bit era.